For more on this topic, our very own Rochelle Akufo spoke with Alex Johnston. She's the director of Catalyst Canada, an organization that creates opportunities for women in businesses. Johnston began by explaining how these quotas are just one approach countries are taking to bring more women in.
I think the quota issue is top of mind because of Germany, but there are really three different approaches around the world that have led to a global conversation around what boards look like and what boards should look like. Quotas is one example, and you're seeing quotas in parts of Europe like Germany, France, Spain, Scandinavian countries. But you've also got regulatory approaches like Australia and Canada, Comply and Explain, which is requiring companies to include goals in their public filings. And you've got in the United Kingdom a voluntary approach, which is really board chairs putting peer pressure on other board chairs to set goals and reach a 30% target. And they're making a great deal of progress. So quotas is one example, but what we're really seeing around the world are three different approaches that have created pretty substantial change across the world in terms of what boards are starting to look like when it comes to women's representation.
Now, some people might ask, why do we need this? What's the significance of having more women in the boardroom?
It's very significant, and I think that, on the one hand, people say if it's a business imperative and business leaders understand the importance of this, why do you need intervention? On the other hand, the reality is change can be tough, and changing patterns and behavior and really getting at complacency often requires, a push and a pull. I think that's what you're seeing in different parts of the world. What I really like about what you're seeing is different countries are adopting approaches that are relevant for them. In Canada, we moved towards Comply and Explain very recently, 4 or 5 months ago, much more similar to Australia. But that's what was right for the Canadian business community, parts of Europe, quotas. I think what you're seeing is governments in conversation with business leaders really assessing what is relevant for their country to create the kind of momentum and shift that they feel is necessary.
And having it in place, that's one thing, but how about monitoring it? How are companies going to be held accountable for meeting the guidelines?
It's a great question. Completely different approaches. Again, in Germany, the approach is going to be a requirement that 30% of the board seats on corporations are filled by women. If companies don't meet that target, board seats will need to remain vacant until they meet the target. So you'll have, potentially empty board seats unless you're hitting the target. In the United Kingdom, voluntary approach, they have an annual report which tracks in pretty significant detail progress in the top 100 and top 250 companies by size, and that's been very effective at really driving the conversation. In Canada, in Canada and Australia, you've got different monitoring bodies, but we will have our regulatory bodies looking at compliance year over year. In Canada, in 3 years, we'll do a review of the regulation and make sure that it's working, and if it isn't, I assume have a different kind of conversation, but I'm optimistic that it will be very effective.
And as this conversation is becoming more mainstream, what sort of response are you seeing from companies about these laws?
The response has been excellent. I think what's happened is, for the most part, there's no one-size-fits-all, but 5, 6, 7 years ago, companies, board chairs, CEOs weren't being pushed to look at this in the same way they are today. What we are seeing, as an organization that really works with companies on their talent development, we work with 800 member companies around the world, is business leaders not only adapting to this, but embracing it, and many more business leaders from very influential companies being real champions of change. I think what's happened is a lot of the, myths, there aren't qualified women, oh my goodness gracious, we're going to have a whole set of unqualified women move on to boards, are being debunked by business leaders themselves who now have experience with very qualified women moving into board seats in their companies, and you're seeing more and more people speak about this very openly and very intentionally about the need to have a board that reflects challenges in a modern world, modern economy, not simply challenges that we might have faced 20, 30 years ago.
Now let's move on to some of the women who are being added to these boards. What sort of criteria do they have to meet?
The same criteria that men had to meet. We're finding that the experience criteria is, women are being appointed to boards in increasing numbers now, but these are qualified individuals in the same way that men were qualified individuals. What we are finding is that business leaders' ability to find qualified women is increasing, not only because the women are there, but they have champions. Increasingly, they have champions who are really pushing them forward, increasing visibility in important networks, and positioning them well for board service. their experience isn't different, their visibility and the kind of person who's really becoming an advocate and champion for them moving onto a board has changed fairly substantially in countries across the world.
Now, what would you tell to male employees who feel that they're equally qualified, but perhaps are being passed over for these positions in favor of a woman?
I would say that I expect men and women are equally qualified for board positions. I think there's ample evidence to show that women for many years have not been moving onto boards, not because of an absence of qualifications, but an absence of the other things like networks, like visibility, that were enabling men to move onto board positions with the same qualifications as women. I think what's happening now is we are casting the net wider, same type of qualifications, different perspectives and experiences, but it really is simply leveling the playing field.
As we look ahead, what sort of outlook do you see for this? Do you see this becoming a trend that will be in place, or do you see perhaps this just being a phase?
Do you mean quotas or change around the board table?
Both. We'll start with the quotas and then the changes in the board table.
Again, because of these three different approaches around the world, we really are seeing different countries adopt approaches that are relevant to them. Quotas is one model, and you're seeing some countries adopt quotas. Canada moved more along the lines of Australia. The UK has had a phenomenal experience with a voluntary approach. They've doubled the numbers of women on boards in the last 4 years, which is quite something, with really just peer pressure. This is not going away. I mean, what you saw is Norway, one country, planted itself around this issue, and it really started to create a cascading effect. And as more and more countries started to look at it and take action, other countries couldn't ignore it. And I think this has become a very robust conversation, and it's certainly not going away. My hope is what we see is it moves into the pipeline and we start to look more effectively at what we need to do to develop our pipeline of female talent better.